Well, I could, Olympia Airport's a kind of a regional, smaller airport. And I did have one story about a pilot of a smaller airline, a jet airplane that had passengers, and he had an emergency, and he was looking for a small airport, and they found one, but it was very small. The closer they got to it, as they were trying to make this emergency landing, it got, it was very short, and in fact, it scared them. They had never had one that short before, but they had to land, and so they were coming down. They put all the full flaps, get ready with the brakes and the reverse engines, and if they had a parachute in the back, they'd probably use that too, because they landed just before the paved part of the runway, and then the other part was really close by, and they had to finally were stopped by bushes at the other end of it, and so they were sweating and they were taking some deep breaths, and he said, "That is the shortest runway I've ever landed on." And the co-pilot looked left and right and said, "Yeah, not only that, it's the widest I've ever seen." Hundreds of feet each direction wide, but anyway. Must have been Crash Landia Airlines. I think Ken Collins, maybe that's the first time he's heard that. He's part of the Olympic Flight Museum. But I want to encourage you to go to the Olympic Flight Museum, located right here in Tumwater, at the Tumwater International Airport. I mean, the Olympia Airport. Port of Olympia. Their museum is well worth the visit. Along with their annual air shows, you know about that. The paper airplane competitions, I think they still have that going on, for kids and adults, really. And just to see some very nicely restored aircraft and related items, including some of the photos that you're going to see today. And I've been looking forward to this. We originally had the administrator, Jeff Johnson, scheduled to speak on this topic this past season, but he had to beg off a little bit so he can collect more of those great photos. And he had more time to collect and organize the historic photographs, and we moved the presentation ahead to today and found out that he had some physical ailments that he had to take care of. So we've got the executive director of the museum, Ken Collins, speaking in his place today, but I think this friendly crowd is going to be encouraging to him. I like to joke about the airport being nicknamed Tumwater International, but it's actually been the Olympia Airport since its beginning, soon after airplanes were invented, actually. Back then, it was outside of Tumwater's town limits, way out in the country, out in the sticks. So I understand why it got Olympia's name, but it has been part of Tumwater's heritage for many years. So to tell all the stories and nice photos, let's have a big Schmidt House welcome for Ken Collins.
Thank you so much, Don. I appreciate that. I appreciate being here today. As he mentioned already, the program originally listed Jeff Johnson. I've come to work with Jeff for quite some time on this display, so we're proud to give it to you today. Jeff will be back in the museum again tomorrow, so I'm coming to fill in for him today. My name is Ken Collins, and I'm with the Olympic Flight Museum. Thank you, Don, and the Trosper family so much for having me here today. This has been a wonderful opportunity for us, and I certainly appreciate everyone coming here today. We've got a packed crowd, and I love to see that. This is a difficult speaking engagement for me for two reasons. First of all, we had Karen Johnson come up and talk to you about art and beer, and I can't offer anything to top that. Then we have Don Trosper come up and tell jokes, and I'm not good at that either. So I'm thinking I'm already 2 strikes down here. I got no beer and no jokes for you. But we're going to see what we can do to make it entertaining anyway, and I've got a lot of great photographs that I want to share with you about the Olympia Airport. So we'll go ahead and jump in first with some other thanks to some people that have donated some articles for us at the Olympic Flight Museum. Of course, you probably already know that the Olympic Flight Museum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and a lot of the things that we get are donations from people just like you that have something, a photograph from their family or a photograph from some relatives that they want to share with other people. They bring them into the museum. Some of the photographs you see today are going to be from Edward and Ellen Mills. They donated some photographs here today. Ken Valkowski also donated some, and Laura Anderson. So I wanted to thank them as well for the donations they made for many of the pictures that you'll see here today. I've got lots of books, lots of photographs, so don't mind me. I'm going to be flipping through some of those as we go along. So let's get started. Talk a little bit about what we can see for the history of the Olympia Airport, or Tumwater International as it's known. So this slide just is a reminder to me to talk a little bit about, it is one of the oldest established airports in the United States. Estimates have varied from 1910 to 1911 as far as the first aircraft that may have come into what later became the original, or the Olympia Airport. We're going to talk a little bit about a timeline. And when we talk about a timeline, I have to go back in history. You know, I'm amazed here today when I started talking to Don and his sister, who are both here today. Don Trosper has a lot of history. His family has history in this area that dates back well into the 1800s. We talk a little bit here about George Bush, and he's one of the ones that came, I understand, from Missouri on the Oregon Trail out to Oregon at the same time as your family did. Is that correct? Okay. So George Bush was another one of the original people that came out on the Oregon Trail from Missouri, came out to Oregon. What George Bush found when he came out here was that he was considered half African American. And so because of his color, there were some problems with donating land at that time to people who were of color. And so he found in Oregon, when he arrived there, he found that they were not as open to giving him sections or parcels of land in Oregon. So he continued and moved up into Washington, north of the Columbia River, where the restrictions were not so tight. Would you say that? British Territory, thank you. British Territory. So when he came up, George Bush came up into the area. He found that they were more open and tolerant, and he started farming in this area that later then became the area in Tumwater. And he found some really fertile land here, and he was very good at farming. And so he found just the right combination that he needed. In fact, he brought some seeds of trees and plants with him from Missouri to plant in this area. And it turned out that he did eventually, he joined the wagon train from Missouri to Oregon, and the Bush family was granted, I put 668 acres is what they estimated. I'm told that a section of land is 640 acres. So, yes, sir, did you have something?
More or less.
More or less, okay. So I guess I'm glad I'm right in there with the more or less part, you know. I'm in that range. So we estimated 668 acres that he was given. And he was well known in the area, as were many of those farmers at that time. He was well known for being quite generous to people, neighbors, the Indians that were here at that time. Several of them had looked to him to start crops, to feed their families. Even the Indians at time, when they found the Indians had illnesses that the Indians had not had before, the Bushes knew something about what to do for them and tried to help the Indians as well in this area. His generosity was well known. And so he, at somewhere around 1910, we believe that an aircraft came into land at that time, what was a field that he owned. He owned quite a bit of farmland. So in the audience today, can I ask how many of you are in an aviation-related occupation? Okay, so we do have some in the back that are. Are you also pilots? Okay, so we have two. Oh, how many more pilots do we have? Quite a few? All right, good. So what I'm going to talk about just for a little bit, just for a moment, is what the original airports were called, because they were not originally airports. They were called aerodromes. Have you heard that word before? Yeah. So aerodromes would normally be a great big wide open field. If they had a great big wide open field with well manicured lawn, that was an aerodrome. And the reason they called it that was because you could take off from an aerodrome in any direction. Now, you know, as a pilot, you want to line your aircraft up into the wind. That's always what we talk about. When you take off, you want to take off into the wind. Is the wind ever the same? I mean, the wind could be literally from any direction. So aerodromes were perfect. A very large circular field that had well-manicured grass you could take off in any direction. And I'm guessing that's why that aircraft probably wanted to land on Bush's prairie land, was because he had fields that looked like they would be perfect for an aerodrome. One of the other things I was going to mention is that on a lot of the early aircraft, sometimes they did not have a tail wheel. They had two main gear up front. The tail wheel was not a wheel, it was a strut. And sometimes the strut that was in the back of the aircraft was used for drag. What they really did was they wanted it to act as a brake. So they could land the aircraft on the main two wheels, and as the tail came down and the skid touched the ground, it would act as a brake. And that's perfect for landing at an aerodrome. Later on, we'll talk a little more about airfields, and that's the term they used. They came up with the word airfield because then they had grass runways that were directional. So what they did was they found what the common direction was for winds in that area, and then they just lined up grass runways for the most common winds, and they became airfields. And now, of course, we call them airports. So I wanted to talk just for a moment about that. I'm betting that first Bush Prairie Farm probably had some aerodromes, big fields that they could take off and land in. And that's why it was so perfect for what they were doing. The Olympia Airport, from 1910 to 1928, we don't have a lot of history on that. I'm guessing that it probably stayed as a grass field for many years. People came in and out and flew from there. In 1928, the Olympia Airport was constructed by members of the Olympia Chamber of Commerce. Have you heard anything else about that?
That's right.
Okay. So I'll tell you what this story reminded me of. It reminded me of something else that we have in this area, the Space Needle. And you're thinking, okay, how is he making this connection? The Space Needle, when it was first proposed to the city of Seattle, and they said, we want to build a monument for the 1962 World's Fair. I see a lot of heads shaking here. The 1962 World's Fair, we want to build a great big Space Needle. And what did the city of Seattle say? Not in our city, you're not. That's going to be a great big old ugly thing, and it's going to be an eyesore, and we are not having that in our city. Go somewhere else. So thank goodness for us, 5 very forward-looking gentlemen went together and bought a piece of land and constructed the Space Needle. Thank God they did, because I'll tell you what, that was the key to the 1962 World's Fair. I'm thinking to myself here kind of the same thing. In Olympia, when they first said we're going to make an airport, the city of Olympia wasn't real up on that. So again, wasn't it the true? People went together, and again, I think it was gentlemen of forward thinking that said, we are going to make an airport, and this is where we want to put it. And the city of Olympia, I don't think, was real open to that at first. But in 1928, they constructed the Olympia Airport, and it is at the location where we know it is now. When it first started, it did not have paved runways. And I have a photograph that I would like to show you now. What I'd like to do is I'd like to pass this around. If you look at the photograph in this direction in the top here, this is the Olympia Airfield when it had no paved runways. I've looked at this quite closely with my magnifying glass, and I did see one airplane. It's right there. So what I'd like to do is pass this around. We have on the back here, it says official photograph, Washington State Highway Department, and it says SR number 1 from Olympia, and then it says 2, and it just says Bush. I believe, that the date on this up in the corner is from 1933. That would make sense that in 1928, when they said it was Olympia Airport, that it did not have paved runways. It only has grass. That's shown here in the photograph. This is only grass. And when it says to Bush, I'm assuming that must be George Bush, and it has one airplane. So if you would, I'd like you to pass this around and take a look at this. It's one of the original documents, one of the original photographs that we have of the Olympia Airfield. And then, let's see, in 1935, a main hangar was built and then expanded in 1937. If you went to the Olympia Airport in 1935, what kind of aircraft would you see? Yeah, some really old stuff, right? It turns out that Jack Cram, how many of you have heard of Jack Randolph Cram? Not a one. That's all right, neither had I, until I started doing this research. It turns out that Jack Randolph Cram was pretty important to the Olympia Airport because in 1935 he was out doing flight instruction in a really cool looking old biplane. And if you wanted to get your pilot's license, Jack Randolph Cram was the man to know. He was at the Olympia Airport giving lessons in this airplane, and then later in 1935 he became the first manager of the Olympia Airport. This is a very interesting document that I found on him, and I'd like to pass this around for you also to take a look at this. Jack Cram was definitely into aviation, a very good instructor. It shows a picture also of one of the proposed sketches that they wanted to make. It's dated in 1941 to expand the Olympia Airport. Some of the aircraft that he flew, and then later on he went into the Second World War. He flew PBY Catalina and did a bombing run on the Japanese, and he was a very accomplished pilot. So I want to pass this around too for everyone to take a look at and talk a little bit about Jack Randolph Cram, the first manager of the Olympia Airport. In fact, there was a proposition that said that they wanted to make the airport named after him. I don't think that ever happened. But he is important in the history of the airport anyway, because he was one of the first instructors and a World War II veteran with some really interesting military background. Gwen Hicks, and I'm sorry, I might have misspelled his name there. It might be Gwin. But Gwen Hicks was the second airport manager. Jack Cram went on to work for the CAA, the Civil Aeronautics Administration, which was the predecessor to the FAA, which we now know as the Federal Aviation Administration. The CAA was the previous name for that same entity. So Gwen Hicks also, very interesting history and background. I have a book here. It's called the OX-5 Aviation Pioneers. The OX-5 is an aviation engine. It's an aircraft engine. The OX-5 became a very popular engine, was used in quite a few different aircraft. It has Gwen Hicks's name right on the front of it. It says organized in 1955. So Gwen Hicks was involved with aviation and aircraft quite considerably sometime before that, but it shows also in here in the book, it shows some of the things that he accomplished as well. I think there's some markers here if you want to take a look at that, and I'll pass this around as well. All right, so there's a little bit of history there. Let's keep going. It gets even better. All right. St. Martin's College. Anyone here an alumni from St. Martin's University? I thought there might be some. Oh, good. Good. Well, St. Martin's College, way back when, was thinking ahead, because in 1939 they thought, you know what? Things aren't looking good in the world right now. In 1939 we were thinking that there were some people at war. And in the United States we thought, you know, it may not be too much longer before this starts to pull us in. We're going to get pulled into this thing. And St. Martin's College said, you know what, we're going to need pilots if that happens. And they were planning ahead. And they started a school and a college and an aviation program that trained quite a number of pilots. And we're going to have some pictures later on that show that. They started in 1939. So they were jumping ahead. They were planning ahead, and it's a good thing they did, because we ended up needing those people later on. In 1941, Olympia Airport became a satellite operation for McCord Airfield. So the military took that over. They took over the Olympia Airport and made it into a military base. In 1942, they had permanent guards on the airfield. and then they started transferring military units into that area. Who it was there, who the military was, is the question that I've had quite a few people ask me. What units were there? So what I put up here is the 37th Flying Training Squadron, 55th Pursuit Group from the Olympia Airport. Have you heard these units before, Don?
I have, yeah.
Okay. But they're probably not the only ones that were there. This picture I want to pass around says 77th Fighter Squadron. And it shows what aircraft? I know you guys know. P38. Who said that? All right. Thank you, sir. The P38. What's the history behind the P38? That's an interesting fighter. Okay. Kelly Johnson designed it. Twin engine. Two fuselage booms coming back. Did very well in the Pacific Theater and became a very popular aircraft for a number of reasons. It was well equipped with machine guns. It could fly for a long range, which they needed over the Pacific Ocean, and they engaged the Japanese out in the Pacific. The P-38s were based here at the Olympia Airport, and so the units, those units that I have listed here, and also I think the 77th Fighter Squadron, those units were both here at Olympia. And this picture down at the bottom, it says dated right on it. It was dated 1941, and then I think it later has another date of 1944. But these pictures, we believe, were taken at the Olympia Airport. I'd like to pass that around. So the P-38 was quite a successful fighter, and the base here at Olympia supported the training that went on with those units for the pilots that later flew in the Pacific Theater. All right. In 1947, the airport was given back to the city of Olympia. In 1944, they had a program that the military was saying, okay, in 1944, the Second World War was basically, at that time, the Second World War was over at the end of 1944. So the military was making an agreement to turn back all of those assets that they had taken for military use in the Second World War. They were ready to turn those back over to the civilians. And so in 1947, the airport came back to the city of Olympia. Those fighter squadrons went away. How many of you have heard stories about P-38s, those P-38 Lightning aircraft that have crashed in local lakes? Yeah, okay. Quite a few of you. I'd like to talk to each and every one of you and have you tell me where those things are, because a P-38 is quite valuable in today's dollars, it turns out. And we would love to find some of those. How many of you have heard that there's some in the bottom of Black Lake? Anybody heard that one? Okay. Where do you think those P-38s are? Where have you been told they're at? Oh, nobody's telling me that. No. I'm $2 million. I'm going to keep that. Right? No, you're not getting that out of me. I had someone come in the museum the other day, not very long ago, and he said, "Are you interested in knowing where the P-38 is that crashed off the end of the runway?" Yes. And he said, "Well, I went there. My dad and we both went there. This is when I was a very small child." And he said, "My dad took me over and said, yeah, there's a P-38 crashed right off the end of the runway here." And I said, "Do you know where it is?" And he said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Well, how do you know for sure it was a P-38? And he goes, "Well, I saw it." I said, "Well, what did you see?" And he said, "Well, I saw the nose of it. You know, it's got a very distinct round nose, and it doesn't have an engine in the front. The engines are out here. So I saw this very sleek, rounded nose, and that's where the machine guns were." "Okay, you're doing good. Keep going." And he said, "Would you like to have some bullets from it?" "Oh, yeah." And he said, "I have a whole bunch of them, 50 caliber bullets." "Yeah, we dug them out of the ground, took them home." "Where are they?" So he goes, "Well, I can't, just give them to you." But he said, "But I can tell you where it is." And I said, meet me later. I don't know for sure what the airport authority would say now if I went back and started digging out there with my little shovel. I'd probably get taken away in handcuffs, but I'm told they're out there. They're out there someplace. All y'all that have a story about that, we'll talk later. I'd like to dig a couple of those up. Hughes Air West provided flying service out of Olympia for 15 years. That's a long time. They were probably flying, good chance they were flying DC-3s. I would say that was a pretty popular aircraft at that time. In fact, in the 1940s and 1950s, there's a good chance that if you bought something from the store that had to be transported by air to get it to where you were buying it, about 80% of the goods that you bought that had to be airlifted from someplace else probably came on a DC-3. Very, very good aircraft. I have a picture I want to show you. And we believe this also was taken at the Olympia Airfield. Capital Airways was one of the largest operators there. And in 1950, they might also have been flying DC-3s. Good chance that they brought those into the Olympia Airport. What else can you tell us about other airlines that might be operating from there?
I don't know about Crashlandia, but make sure you speak loud.
Okay.
But it's, I don't know, there's many of them that have come through.
Quite a number of airline operators through the Olympia area. In fact, one of the questions we get quite often is, why is there no airline service, scheduled airline service from Olympia? A lot of head shaking. I wish I knew more. Right now, I was talking to Rudy Rudolph, who is the current airport manager, and he tells me there's quite a number. There's a list of reasons why there's no scheduled airline service from Olympia. I wish we had it. It was here before. Quite a number of airlines were here in Olympia, but we'll just have to wait and see. Yes, sir.
I think one of the reasons is when the airline comes in, the state government makes a deal that we'll pay for so many seats, whether we use them or not, for the first year, which is enough to get the airline there. I think San Juan was there for a while. And after the year, there's just not enough traffic through there to support it.
It's so convenient driving to Seatown.
Yeah. It used to take 3 hours to get to Seatown, not 5.
I never get to make the jokes. Yeah. What I have found out, thank you for that comment, what I have found out, it's really easy to drive to Portland. But, we'll wait and see. Maybe someday Olympia will have scheduled airline service again, I hope. But it used to be the case, and we'll just see what the future holds for us. Washington State Patrol came up to me this year for the 2019 Air Show out at the Olympia Airport, June 21st, and Father's Day weekend. Every year on Father's Day weekend, we have the Olympia Airport Air Show. The Washington State Patrol came to me this year and said, we would like to join and be a part of the air show. And I said, well, fantastic. We would love to have you. What would you like to do? And they said, we want to open our hangar up. We're going to pull some aircraft out. We're going to have all kinds of things on display. People can come over and see what the Washington State Patrol really does with their aviation assets. And I said, we would love to have you. That is an important thing. The reason that they did that was to celebrate their 60th anniversary of the aviation division within the Washington State Patrol. Yeah. So any of you, did you get out to see the Washington State Patrol there at the air show this year? Okay, good. We've got some hands in the back. Yeah, they put out some really cool aircraft. How many of you already knew that the Washington State Patrol provides the pilots for the governor when the governor goes on trips? You already knew that. There are about 5 other Cessnas that they fly around. The big aircraft that the governor uses is a Beechcraft King Air. That's a very nice, very well-equipped turboprop aircraft, and that's what he uses if he wants to go to Spokane or something like that. You know, the Washington State Patrol provides all the security and all the pilots for the governor on his trips. We have about 5 other Cessnas that they use. You know what they use those Cessnas for? Yeah, tracking y'all going to Seattle. That's what they're doing. Yeah, they got radar on that thing. Yeah, they got a pod. If you ever see a Cessna taxiing out, it's white, has a little blue stripe on the tail, and it's got a pod under the left wing. And that pod is looking at you. That's what it's doing, catching all them speeders. And so they have a few aircraft like that they put out. And if you come to the air show again next year in 2020, you'll get to see them again. Washington State Patrol said that was so successful that they're going to do it every year. So if you want to come out and see Washington State Patrol's aircraft, they'll have them out every year now at the air show. But they were celebrating their 60th anniversary this year, and we were glad to have them. 1963, the city of Olympia turned the airport over to the Port of Olympia. At that time, estimated to be about 700 acres. We're going to talk a little more about how the airport continues to expand, and there's more acreage now, but at that time, about 700. In 66, how many of you were around to see the Paul Loudon Airport? Any of you here for that? Never heard of it. I don't know. The airport name has changed several times. Then they've suggested, just like I mentioned with Jack Randolph Cram, they suggested that his name be associated with the airport. Also, Paul Loudon Airport after a World War I pilot. Any other names that you've heard of that suggested for the Olympia Airport? Pearson. Okay, I hadn't heard that one. Okay, and they're all certainly good choices. There's reasons why they would back any one of those. But right now, we'll talk a little bit later. The name of it remains the Olympia Regional Airport. That's what it was changed to not long ago. First air traffic control tower, I was told, was built in 1973. Do you know if? Okay. And then they said in 1975 they built a new tower. So we've had several towers there, and we're going to show some slides here in a minute that show some of the other towers. They've had several air traffic control towers at the airport. The initial ones looked really sparse. Later ones looked really nice. And if you go out there today, they have quite a modern facility. And so we'll talk a little about how that has changed as well. In 1987, the airport was about 700 acres and the air industrial complex about 800 acres. So it continues to expand. All right. In 1987, the airport is annexed to Tumwater, and that's why we were talking. Yeah, I haven't changed the name yet. We get that all the time. The Olympic Flight Museum is based on the airport property, and every once in a while we get someone that calls and says, I'd like to come to see your museum, but I can't figure out what city it's in. Is it in Olympia or is it in Tumwater? So we have to talk about that a little bit in terms of the zoning and the annexing of the city. Renamed the Olympia Regional Airport in 1997. This is just a shameful commercial plug here I put in for the Olympic Flight Museum. Started in 1998, and the first group of fly-ins, gathering of warbirds and Olympic air shows started in 1999. Brian Reynolds is the owner of the Olympic Flight Museum, and he's an astonishing pilot. I can tell you that firsthand, having flown with him many times. And he has quite an eclectic group of aircraft at the Olympic Flight Museum, and he likes to put on an air show every year, as I mentioned, on Father's Day weekend. All right. Some of you, as you came in, probably saw that I had some air show brochures. I only brought a couple with me. I didn't know how big the crowd was going to be. Sorry, but we have more at the Flight Museum if you want to have more. We also have some more brochures back there about the Olympic Flight Museum. Tells a little bit about its history and what we have to show you if you come in there. Let's talk about some pictures. Let's look at some cool pictures. I always like that. Take a look at this thing. Yeah. You probably can't read that, but down at the bottom it says Olympia, Washington, 1911. Asheville Curtis photo. So we believe that this photograph was taken in 1911. Now, the location. Don Trosper and I talked just a moment ago. We talked about where the location of this would probably be. And Don, if you could tell them what you were thinking.
Well, because of the buildings in the background, it's probably the landfill that created the Port of Olympia property that was all filled on there. And so there was an empty space for quite a while, and the early barnstormers would fly in there with their biplanes.
I absolutely believe that's true. And because I think at the property that was the Olympia Airfield was probably just large flatlands, fields and prairie lands and stuff like that. Yeah, no buildings like this. So what I thought was cool about it was it's interesting because we see some people in the foreground here, and there have a photographer, and it looks like another well-dressed couple standing next to the photographer, and they said, well, we want to get a picture of this airplane. Then you see about 40 people on the side running for their lives. They're not sure where this thing's going to end up. They just don't want it to end up on them. So you see a bunch of people scattering. Boy, I would have given a lot to see that. That would have been fun. Here comes this biplane. Oh, Lord, everybody starts running. And so it may not have been fully under control. It may have been subject to winds or something else. And so they were trying to scatter. But it was a very interesting photograph, dated from 1911, and we know it was in Olympia. Let's look at more modern times. This picture is going to come up several times. We have a St. Martin's University alumni with us. This is the class, one of the classes from 1939. This photograph was dated from the St. Martin's College. This is the group of young men that were all part of that original training. The hangar that you can see in the background says Broker Hicks Flying Service. It's likely that Jack Cram and Gwen Hicks and a lot of those folks had something to do with the original starting of these buildings. And you can see in the back where it says Olympia Airport. How many of you recognize that as the Washington State Patrol hangar? Yeah, that's what it is. That's the original hangar there. On the other side, it has First Flight, Olympia, Washington, via Airmail. Is Karen still with us in the back? Karen, you had a very interesting story that I really enjoyed talking about Lindbergh flying over Olympia. Can I share that with them, or can you come up? Okay. So how many of you know what year it was that Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic? Yeah, everybody knew that. Boy, I'm not going to fool this crowd. 1927. And I hear a lot of people say to me, they go, oh yeah, Lindbergh was the first one to cross the Atlantic. And I say, no, he wasn't. Well, yeah, he was. No, he wasn't. What do you mean he wasn't? I say, Lindbergh was the first one to cross the Atlantic solo. Thank you. Who said that? Solo. Yes, he was. The Navy had crossed the Atlantic before that, but they had a group of 3 planes, and I think only one actually made the trip. Yeah, he was the first one to do it solo in 1927. So what Karen said to me was that later in that year, we believe later in 1927, that he flew into Seattle. And what was it in Seattle that he was going to see? Okay, promoting the Airmail service, stopped in Seattle, and he was on his way to Portland, I believe. And on his way to Portland, they asked him, well, can you circle around Olympia? Can we take a picture of you? So he came down to Olympia and circled over the capital, as I understand it, and then flew on to Portland. So I wanted to, one of the things that I wanted to mention was that when I see this Airmail, that's what it makes me think of, is they were trying to get, to promote Airmail in the United States at that time from 1927 on. That was the way the airplanes made money back then. They weren't very good at carrying passengers. How many of you have ever ridden in an open biplane, open cockpit biplane? Oh, I see a lot of hands. My wife and I did that just not too long ago. We were up, it turns out we were in the San Juan Islands, and there's a company up there, a couple of them I think, that offer rides and open cockpit biplanes. And I thought, as old as I am and as long as I've been in aviation and I've never been in one of these, I'm going to have to do that. So my wife and I both got in one. There was one that has 2 seats up front and a pilot in the back. And we got to fly in it. And I thought, this is the neatest thing, really. I mean, you want to get wind in your hair. Boy, I'll tell you what, you do that in a hurry. I didn't know how much wind could get in my hair. And so if you imagine flying like that as a passenger, I mean, you know, they probably didn't do real well for passenger service if you had to sit in an open cockpit biplane. So Airmail is the way they made their money, and that's what he was here to promote. The OX5 book that I handed out that you're looking at from Gwen Hicks, the OX5, as I mentioned, was an aviation engine. It was used in several different aircraft. This talks a little bit about the OX5 Club of America and shows some pictures of some of the aircraft that engine might have been used in. On the other side, again, the St. Martin students picture. That's a very popular one. I didn't realize I had it in there 3 times, but but that is, again, just promoting what they did at the Olympia Airport. So this picture is the picture that I was sending around the room. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, you can take a look at the history of Jack Randolph Cram. And again, one of the envelopes there that was promoting air service. We talked a little bit about air traffic control towers. And I think the picture on the right, it might represent one of the first ones that was at the Olympia Airport. And it looks amazingly like another similar structure. Have any of you seen some of those observation towers that they have out in the forest? Yeah, yeah, from the Forest Service. It looks like that, doesn't it? I think, in fact, that's probably what it's based on. That would be my guess, because the structure looks very similar to one of the Forest Service towers where they spot fires and so forth in national parks and forests. The one on the left, that one is a much more modern building. In fact, the Washington State Patrol hangar had the control tower. I think the first one, one of the first ones, was on the top of that hangar. We have several pictures of the Washington State Patrol hangar that has a tower on top of it. So it could be that this is one of the first ones that was put up on the Washington State Patrol hangar and then later moved. The 39 class is shown on the right-hand side. The left side is very interesting to me because it shows the proposal for things that were never actually built. This is a proposal, I believe this is from the 1940s when they had the P38 bases there. I believe that they were going to have different runways, taxiways, and things for servicing those P38s. And I believe that's what that's showing. That never actually came to fruition. But if you look at that photograph that I handed out, the black and white photograph, it shows the basis of 2 runways, but not 3. This one is showing 3. For the pilots in the audience, I'd like to take just a moment and ask you if you've seen this before. As a pilot, I frequently fly. I get out my chart. I want to say I'm going from Olympia. I'm going down to McMinnville, Oregon. I look along the path and I say, okay, what are the airports? If I needed an emergency landing spot, what would I pick? Sometimes I look at the airport and look at the way it's laid out. If I see an airport that has 3 triangle-shaped runways, I know almost immediately that was built in World War II. Any of you found that as our pilots? Have you found that? That's true? Yes. If I see 3 very long, very distinct, well-paved runways, I just say, oh, it was built in 1940s or in World War II. And people look at me and they go, okay, how did you make that leap? Well, because in 1942, the government put those runways in and they had money. If you were trying to make an airport today, it would have one runway and barely wide enough for you to get your airplane onto. But in World War II, the government was funding that, and they have big triangular-shaped runways, and that just tells me I'm going to land there. because whatever that is, that's a big place. I can get my airplane down on that because those runways are probably 6,000 feet long. And so I got a big runway under me if I go to one of those bases. This never actually happened, but it was an interesting drawing. I liked the way that it was laid out. There was a proposal. It's just a proposal that never was built. But that one was from, I believe, from 1944. On the right-hand side, again, you can see some of the hangars that include, I think, on the far right there, the Washington State Patrol hangar and some of the other ones that were built in that area. And I think Broker Hicks, this is one of their original hangars that's on the left here. It shows a biplane. And look at the cool old cars. Yeah. That dates that one as well. On the right-hand side, a DC-3 with the Washington State Patrol hangar in the background, I believe. I cannot identify this aircraft. I don't know exactly what that is. All I know is I wouldn't ride in it. But it looks interesting. And so you can see, I think, another biplane in the background there. These also from Olympia. The OX-5 Aviation Pioneers, again, if you're looking at that book, you can take a look at who all is included in that. It's really a list of who's who from that time on, from established in 1955 and then goes through the current time. And then over on the right, it says Gwen Hicks belonged to a group called the Grasshoppers. Have any of you ever heard of the Grasshoppers? Okay, I had not either. So it shows Grasshoppers, and then it gives a list of aircraft and so forth. And it says this certifies that Gwen Hicks is a Grasshopper. So that must be a club or some kind of an aviation-related club that he formed or that he was a member of at the Olympia Airport. I like these photographs. On the right, a DC-3, and you can see the buildings, towers, and trees in the background. Very interesting picture from Olympia Airport. And the B-17 on this side, with some women on horses that came in to look at the B-17, and I believe those both from Olympia Airport as well. This is interesting. Another photograph of a DC-3 on the right with the Washington State Patrol hangar. And this one on the left, we believe, was an aerial photograph taken from an airplane. That looks like that's correct because they had a lot of flying wires and struts on those aircraft, the old biplanes. And what you're looking through is a maze of wires and struts that would be probably on the left wing of that aircraft as you're looking out toward the Olympia Airfield. And it shows there some hangars, some towers, and some buildings that were on the side of the runways there at the airport. Kind of a neat little picture that we have there. There's our military men. Yeah. Oh yeah, you can trust those guys with your life right there. 1941, and the truck that they're so proud of on this side. Likely an ambulance or some other kind of vehicle like that. These were dated from 1941. The picture on the right says Olympia Airport, August of 1941, and it has some of the aircraft that would have been here. And this one, I think, is the one where I was talking about the Washington State Patrol hangar with the tower on the top. If you look at the picture on the right, I think the control tower was actually in the top of that hangar. And then on the left, the P38 photographs that we've been passing around with the P38 aircraft. All right, so a little bit of current times. We skipped over some of the times there. From the 60s and 70s, the airport obviously had a number of FBOs, fixed base operators, had a number of airlines come and go, had a number of other things, and that if you come to the museum, we can probably talk more about that. The current airport manager is Rudy Rudolph. He's the one, I don't believe he's here today, but he is the one that gave me some facts and statistics to help make this. About 20 aviation-related businesses are inside the fence, and about 7 more are on the outside of the fence. One of the things that's on the outside of the fence is Northwest Helicopters. It's on the south side of the field. Their property abuts the aircraft or the airport's property. And so Northwest Helicopters and the Olympic Flight Museum are both owned by Brian Reynolds, so that's a parent company. So Northwest Helicopters is a parent company for the Olympic Flight Museum. And that's one of those 7 businesses that are just outside the fence, although the property adjoins each other. Over 200 people employed by the airport. That number is probably a lot larger now than statistically when I got this. Some of the references that I used, I wanted to thank Don Trosper again for your help here and your family's help in this area to provide us a location like this to have such a briefing at the Schmidt House. This has been really exciting for me. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And we have some other, Evergreen State College did a report that I got some of the pictures and information from. And you can see some of the other references that I used. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that I had the privilege of being out at the Olympia Airport in 1973. I don't know how many of you were here at that time. How many of you remember Vagabond Aviation was out on the airfield in 1973? A lot of hands. A lot of hands. Well, good. I'm glad you remember that. I went out in 1973. I went out and flew with them and received my private pilot's license right there from Vagabond Aviation. And so I have a lot of ties to the Olympia Airport, and I didn't know all of this until I came here to present it, but I've been out at the Olympia Airport off and on ever since. I went in the military. I had 20 years that I was away and a military career. I retired and then came back to the same place again. I was very fortunate that I found someone who was willing to hire me and use my aviation military experience to transfer right into the civilian world. So I still do helicopter flights, some airplane flights from the airport. And of course, I'm now the executive director of the museum. So I'd love to talk to any of you about any of that. If you'd like to come out to the museum at any time and talk about the airport or the flight museum, we'd love to have you. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions, and I'm sure I must have a lot of questions. So go ahead and just lay them on me. Yes, please, in the back.
In the early 70s, my 2 older boys belonged to the Civil Air Patrol out there. Do they still have Civil Air Patrol for the young adults?
Yes, we do. And this is when, is someone from the Civil Air Patrol here? Okay. So most of the time when we interact with the Civil Air Patrol is during our air show. So the Civil Air Patrol have a lot of cadets that they bring out for the air show. They usually have a supervisor, a lieutenant that comes out, and then they have other people that come out to help supervise the cadets. And they do a lot of the parking, and they do a lot of aircraft marshaling, quite a few services that they provide for us every year for the air show. So yes, I would say the Civil Air Patrol has an active squadron here. And they participate with us every year at the air show. All right, I had another hand up here. Yes, please.
So you now have the regular air show each year. Do you know historically, were there barnstormers and air shows that went on back in the day at the airport?
Yes. We don't have a lot of history on what occurred at what time, but we do have a very interesting display about a woman in aviation who was a wing walker. And we have a display in the museum, and she has letters from the 1920s and 1930s that she wrote back to her family saying she was having a great time on this air tour. And the air tour apparently came through Olympia at one point. And so we do have some record that there were aviation-related events like that at the Olympia Airport, even as far back as the 1920s. I'm sure that the airport has had some kind of, we used to call them fly-ins, and then they changed to warbird fly-ins, and then other displays like that. Now we call them the air show. But I'm sure that Olympia has been involved almost throughout its history with those type of flying demonstrations because it's just good for business, gets people excited about aviation. I'm sure that that's been here for most of its life as an airport, yes. What other questions? Yes, please.
Do you know how many World War II era airports there have been? I'm thinking Toledo and maybe Sanderson Field and Shelton. How many of them are in the local area or in Washington State?
Well, I don't know the exact number. Washington is very lucky to have almost 150 airports in the state, just in one state, in Washington. There are quite a large number of airports. And if you go to most of the major cities like Spokane, if you go to Spokane, and you mentioned like or Shelton, some of the others, most of the major cities have airports that you can look at the diagram and just tell what they are. And so how many, I'm not really sure of the number that were World War II bases that were here, but I would say maybe a dozen that are within the state of Washington. Moses Lake, certainly. How many of you know that Moses Lake has the longest runway in Washington state? Thank you very much. 15,000 feet. Yeah, that's very long. In fact, it's so long that Moses Lake was considered as an alternate landing airport for the space shuttle. How many of you had already known that? Quite a few of you did. Yeah, Moses Lake has a really, really long airport. If I took my Huey helicopter over to Moses Lake's longest runway, I think I could probably land and pick up again probably 100 times or so. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Yes. Yes, sir.
Two questions.
Yes.
1910, they were flying in there. When was the Wright brothers' first flight? This wasn't very long after the Wright brothers.
Very good point.
So what the hell kinds of airplanes were they flying? And why were they coming into Olympia? What was the reason people would even fly to Olympia?
Good questions. And I would say yes.
I don't remember Wright brothers, what, 2000 or 19...
Yeah, 1903.
So 1910 was not very long. I mean, airplanes must have progressed substantially from the Wright brothers' first flyer to when they were flying into the Olympia Airport.
Well, I'm guessing that, based on that first photograph we saw with the people running, was taken in.
I mean, so there's quite a progression from the Wright brothers' flyer to biplanes.
Yes.
In a very short period of time.
Yes.
And it boggles my brain they would be flying those things into Olympia Airport. And when were the runways paved for the first time? Do you know?
I'm thinking, in the 30s. I think so. Yes.
But we don't really know much about those first airplanes that flew.
No.
Why they were here? We just know they did.
Yes. You're right. 1903 was the Wright brothers were credited with the first flight in 1903. And this picture is dated 1911, and you can see the biplane there. And it doesn't look significantly different to me than the Wright Flyer. But, I can't tell exactly what that is. But, yeah, you're right. I think they did advance quickly. And in 1911, they probably were more stable, and I would guess looked like maybe they wouldn't kill a big crowd of audience or something. I don't know.
And
Yes.
just getting here, they had to make a bunch of stops.
Yes.
To get here.
Yes. I was reading a little bit about George Bush, whose property was originally dedicated or in the same area as the Olympia Airport. I was reading a little about that, and I thought the same thing myself. I thought, why did someone land on that field? And I'm guessing that someone had an aircraft, and I don't know if they had arranged this with him prior to that, or if they had just flown in like they were going to crash there. I don't know, but they probably saw a great big wide open field and just thought, well, this looks good. And so they set it down there, and then George Bush said, well, yeah, you guys can use it if you want to. I'm guessing, I don't know, that might have been the original start of it in 1911 when they flew into his property. It might have been just a fluke, but
Why would they have even flown here?
I don't know. Yeah. Well, they wanted to get, Tacoma, when we go back to the history of Tumwater. When we go back to the history of Tumwater and the Indians that lived here and so forth, they chose this area for good reason, because it had a lot of water, it had lakes, it had rivers, they had a lot of commerce here, trees, so forth, that they could use, natural resources in the area. So maybe it attracted a lot of people for that reason alone. Yeah. So thank you so much for being here today. I'd like to have a round of applause for Don Trosper and his family.